Sometimes whole battles involving hundreds of men were staged with real weapons. Amid all these leaping cats and flying spears, how often were spectators injured or worse at the Roman games? Let's focus on the Colosseum, where the grandest Roman spectacles were staged. By most estimates, the Colosseum had seats for about 50,000 spectators. As I discussed in my old video on finding good seats in the Colosseum, the worst seats were at the top, where slaves and women stood on rickety benches. Below were the non-elite sections of the Mineanum, the general admission section, where spectators crowded onto narrow stone benches. The lowest part of the Mineanum, separated by a walkway from the rows above, was reserved for members of the equestrian order. These benches were made of marble and were wider, signs of the high social standing of the men who occupied them. But the really luxurious seating was in the podium, closest to the arena, where members of the Senate sat with their wives, children, and attendants. The podium consisted of several broad marble tiers. There were no benches. The senators brought their own cushioned chairs. The best seats in the house were on the minor axes of the podium, that is, at the middle of the Colosseum's long sides. On one side was the imperial box, where the emperor and his entourage sat. On the other was probably the pulvinar, where images and attributes of the gods and deified emperors were displayed on elaborate chairs. Other special sections were set aside for the Vestal Virgins and visiting dignitaries. The seats in the podium of the Colosseum had ready access to all the amphitheater's amenities, the water fountains and lavatories of the corridors, the perfumed mist that effused from the walls in hot weather, and, in all likelihood, the vendors of wine and snacks who worked the seats. Speaking of food, a brief word about this video's sponsor. Ready to feel your best while making the most of your summer adventures? Off by using TotalStone50 at Factor75.com. Returning to our topic. The most important people in Rome, including the emperor and his family, were seated in the first rows of the Colosseum. How were they protected from stray arrows and leading tigers? The arena was ringed by a 13-foot travertine wall, which was crowned by a barrier. Although no trace survives, most scholars assume that it resembled the fence that protected spectators in the amphitheater of Nero. Elephant tusks projecting from the arena wall supported nets of gilded wire. At the net's base were rows of ivory rollers, designed to prevent big cats from crawling up the wall. In the Colosseum, armed guards likely patrolled the walkway between the barrier and the first tier of the podium. Sharpshooters armed with bows seem to have also been stationed at intervals along the podium's base, ready to react if an animal or gladiator tried to scale the barrier. Despite such precautions, several disasters occurred in Roman amphitheaters. The most notorious took place during the reign of Tiberius, when a temporary wooden amphitheater in the town of Fidnae collapsed, killing 20,000 spectators. In the reign of Nero, during a gladiatorial show, a brawl that broke out in the stands of Pompey's amphitheater escalated from shouting and stone throwing to a full-scale battle that left dozens dead. The Senate, wary of future unrest, banned Pompey from hosting gladiatorial games for the next 10 years. We also hear about the mundane risks of watching the games. Heat stroke, for example, seems to have been a problem in the lower rows, which were constantly exposed to the sun. It was probably in response to some dramatic incident that Caligula allowed senators to wear sun hats during the games. The animals gathered for beast hunts sometimes escaped before they reached the arena. We hear, for example, about a rogue leopard attacking an artist, and about a massive Indian python that was rumored to hunt children in the slums of Rome. As far as we know, however, no animal managed to make it over the barrier of the Colosseum. Nor, remarkably, are we aware of any fatalities in the stands caused by the arrows and javelins of the beast hunters. Gladiators normally posed little danger to spectators, partly because their weapons were designed for close combat, and more generally because no gladiator who hoped for freedom was likely to risk his future on a throw wild enough to end up in the stands. Yet gladiators did cause spectator fatalities, at least outside Rome. According to Valerius Maximus, writing in the reign of Tiberius, an equestrian named Rufus dreamed one night that he would be killed by a gladiator. The next day, accompanying some friends to the theater of Syracuse, Rufus was shocked to recognize the gladiator from his dream. Persuaded by his friends that he was being ridiculous, Rufus took his seat and watched the gladiator beat his opponent to the ground. As the gladiator prepared to deal the final blow, he raised his sword high and skewered Rufus, who was seated in the front row, through the heart. Although we have no way of knowing whether this anecdote has basis in truth, its setting in the theater of Syracuse lends it some plausibility. Greek theaters were not designed for gladiatorial combats and beast shows. Only a low wall, if anything, separated their stages and orchestras from the seats. Unless temporary barriers or nets were set up, spectators in the first rows were uncomfortably vulnerable. Although high walls and nets protected spectators in the Colosseum from gladiators, they were still exposed to the whims of the emperors. During the reign of Domitian, a spectator sitting near the imperial box complained that the emperor had rigged the games so that his favorite gladiators always won. Furious, Domitian sent guards to drag the man from his seat and feed him to wild dogs in the arena. A century later, it was rumored that Commodus planned to shoot random spectators at the Colosseum in imitation of Hercules and his Stymphalian birds. We don't know how many spectators were injured or killed over the centuries at the Colosseum. Our sources are incomplete and only mention such accidents if they happen to involve an emperor or a famous figure. But to judge from what we do know, it seems that a day at the Colosseum was never free from danger, even for those in the stands. For more on the Colosseum.
Ancient Rome was a multi-ethnic society with a large population that required a broad spectrum of jobs to sustain its economy. However, choosing their career was not always an option for the general people. This was only possible for people with higher status or inherited roles. Prestigious professions, military leadership, and political administration were reserved for the Roman upper class, whereas ordinary people were involved in various jobs. Moreover, the Roman Empire depended on slaves, and any wealthy person could keep as many as 500 slaves. The slaves were controlled such that they had to partake in challenging, unpleasant works of low esteem. The typical jobs were farming, construction, and domestic services, and educated slaves could work in medicine, teaching, accounting, and artists. Some jobs, however, like the orgy planner or urine collector, were bizarre even to the slaves. So today we will take a look at the weird Roman job. The weirder a job is, the higher it is ranked on the list, while more normal jobs are ranked lower. Artists. Some jobs, however, like the orgy planner or urine collector, were bizarre even to the slaves. So today we will take a look at the weird Roman job. The weirder a job is, the higher it is ranked on the list, while more normal jobs are ranked lower. Let's start off the F tier with a job that actually still exists today, even though it may have changed slightly. Just like our astrologists who try to predict your future by your zodiac sign or tarot cards, the ancient Romans had their own version of that profession.
You're a Gemini, you probably experienced deja vu, the feeling that this moment has happened before. And you also experienced deja vu, the feeling that this moment has happened before.
The Polarius were chicken interpreters who told the fortune of military campaigns based on how chickens ate. Instead of being tasked with taking care of more regal birds like eagles or owls, the Polarius had to take care of sacred military chickens. Sacred military chickens. One of the strongest empires in history literally had chickens that were relied on to tell whether a battle would go well or not for the Roman army. Before a battle, a Polarius would release the chickens and throw corn on the ground. If the chickens ate, all was well. If they ate so messily they dropped kernels, even better. If they didn't eat, oh no. If they refuse to come out of their cages, you may as well send everyone home. There even is a story about one Roman fleet commander who was so impatient with the poor birds, who were understandably dizzy from sailing, not wanting to come out of their cage, that he threw them overboard. He lost the battle and was scolded for drowning his fleet's sacred war chickens. I think this profession perfectly defines the F tier. It is somewhat strange, but considering that we still do the same thing today, it's kind of normal, at least for this list. We all know it, and we all hate it. You are at a party and someone approaches you, but damn, you forgot their name, which could result in embarrassment. Sucks for you, but the Romans were perfectly prepared for such a situation. The Roman profession of name caller or nomenclator had one simple task: to remember everyone's name at a party or other event. As efficient as the Romans were, they had a backup for not remembering people's names at gatherings and parties, saving themselves from embarrassment. When people would approach their masters, the nomenclator would loudly announce the name of whoever would come, saving a deadly social embarrassment. What sounds like a funny party gimmick at first was actually also a crucial political instrument. Political candidates would be accompanied by their respective nomenclators, who prevented any embarrassment for the candidate. Whenever someone would approach the candidates in a friendly or personal manner, they would ensure the candidate by calling out the approaching person's name out loud. That's why this job is in F tier, since it isn't really weird, but rather unique. The last candidate for the F tier is the position of Vestal Virgins. In ancient Rome, the Vestals were known to be the priestesses of the Roman goddess Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and were considered vital to the security of Rome. The duty of the Vestals was to keep the fire in the temple of Vesta burning. They believed that the failure to do so would lead to chaos in the empire. It was essential for the Romans that the Vestals were virgins.
I touched the finish line, but you've never touched a woman.
You're right, I haven't lost my virginity.
This was obviously a drawback and a risk at the same time. If they were to lose their virginity, they were usually walled alive and then left to dehydrate, a truly brutal punishment. Other Vestals who broke any other vow, such as letting the temple fire go out, were beaten behind a curtain in the dark. However, the good in all this was that they were treated fairly well and given special game seats. So all in all, I would consider this job to be quite normal, especially considering that even modern monks and nuns still vow to abstain from any sexual activity, although luckily the punishments today aren't nearly as harsh. Now we enter the E tier with a rather interesting but kind of controversial job. In the ancient world, a funeral clown was common enough to leave behind records of clowns making fun of the dead at their own funerals. These funeral clowns would mimic the behavior of the deceased. It wasn't just any behavior either. They specifically picked ones that made the deceased look bad. Of course, this was done in a funny way that wouldn't offend the audience, which was likely made up of friends and family who wouldn't tolerate actual slander. One amusing account from Suetonius, a Roman historian, tells of a funeral clown mocking Vespasian, the emperor famous for his role in building the Colosseum, for his stinginess. The funeral clown was said to have asked the crowd, while still pretending to be Vespasian, how much the funeral would cost him. Considering that most of our modern death rituals are connected with immense grief, this might seem weird to many of you. However, I think the concept that a dead person gives his friends and relatives one last laugh through one of these clowns doesn't sound too bad. In ancient Rome, asking the gods for help was common if one could not personally take revenge. A curse against their enemies was ordered by the hateful and the superstitious. The middlemen between the gods and the hateful person were called curse tablet scribes. The entire day they would hear people's complaints of hate for others and the wrongdoings they had endured. They would take people's requests for revenge and etch a curse onto a soft lead plate. Those curse tablets were believed to have influential power against the gods, and they would either be nailed to the wall of temples or rolled up, placed underground in graves, or thrown into wells or lakes. All manners of cruel punishments consisting of blindness, madness, and hopes of the enemy's intestines being eaten away would be wished for in those curses. The treatment done to the material was compared to what should be done to the target of the spell. The curses would be written backward if needed to be extra effective. That's definitely a weird custom, but considering nowadays people use fake Twitter accounts to insult other people, this concept doesn't seem too far-fetched. Now we are coming into the D tier featuring the fuller. Fulling is the process of cleaning clothes, especially wool, to remove oils, dirt, and other impurities and make them thicker. Ancient Roman times were popular for fulling by making the slaves stand ankle deep in the urine. As filthy as it sounds, the practicality of the concept lies in the fact that urine was a source of ammonium salts. It was known as the wash that assisted in cleansing and whitening clothes. The use of urine faded when more sophisticated concepts of water mills came into place. The job itself was basically a very early form of someone doing laundry, which isn't weird at all. However, the part where you have to stand in ankle deep urine makes this whole thing relatively unpleasant, I would imagine. However, urine was actually so important in ancient Rome that they even had official urine tax collectors who, spoiler, will be featured later on this list. Another candidate for this tier is the position of armpit hair plucker. Armpit hair pluckers filled bathhouses with the screams of their clients. Roman baths were hubs of public life and of public image. One of the many services offered at the baths was armpit plucking, employed by bathhouse guilds to manually pluck the armpit hairs of patrons with tweezers. The philosopher Seneca notes that the armpit pluckers would shout in the bathhouses to get people to get their pits plucked, and when the pit plucker wasn't shouting, he was forcing his customer to shriek instead of him. Honestly, this job was pretty normal considering that armpit waxing isn't out of the ordinary even today. However, I think that turning this waxing process into a public event at the bathhouse makes it a little weirder than it needed to be. Now we enter the C tier, the perfect middle ground between somewhat normal jobs that are also pretty weird. Vicarious were the middle managers between their masters and their fellow slaves. And yeah, we're literally talking about real middle manager slaves who managed other slaves.
That just sounds like slavery with extra steps.
Ooh la la, someone's gonna get laid in college.
According to Vicky Leon, author of Working 9 to V, slave owners would buy slaves to serve as their body doubles at work and do their work for them. These vicarious would then be lived vicariously by their owners, who would send them to do office work. It wasn't so bad of a gig either, since it turns out that some vicars would be given access to part or all of their master's assets. Some of them would be paid a portion of the profits made, allowing them to eventually buy their freedoms. Ironically, more enterprising slaves, however, would opt to buy their own vicarious and continue growing their master's wealth so they could continue taking a cut. So while this management position isn't far off from modern businesses, the ancient slaves aspect makes that job very questionable. We finally enter the B tier with the job everyone has been looking forward to, the Roman orgy planner. The planners were responsible for planning the perfect orgies and sex parties where guests freely partake in open and unrestrained sexual activities, including group sex. They had the authority to select the food, drinks, and music, as well as women. Those women could attend the orgy who were capable of making the event of utmost entertainment for the guests. The Greco-Roman world shared the party god Bacchus, lord of wine and ritual madness, and celebrated him with the Bacchanalia. Attendance of these parties had a tendency to really tap into that divine crazy party energy and go around on a debauched, often violent sex spree. At one orgy, legendary bisexual Alcibiades, an Athenian statesman, and his homies stole the dicks of hundreds of statues throughout Athens. However, the planners were despised, especially by the lower class, as they thought the entire event to be unnecessarily luxurious and expensive, or simply because they didn't get an invite themselves. All in all, the job must have been really funny, but I think I don't even have to explain why this job description might seem weird to some people. We start off the A tier with the position of Stercorarius, or to say it more bluntly, the shit collector.
That is one big pile of shit.
Ancient Rome was famous for its aqueducts and toilets, innovations that were so advanced it would take centuries to see them return after the fall of Rome. What a lot of people forget is that a lot of these advanced services were available only for important public buildings. Think of the noisy bathhouse where the armpit plucker is trying to pluck your pits, or government buildings, regular residential areas where most people lived, not on the plumbing grid. That's why the Stercorarius had to go from house to house and collect people's shit from their cesspools, bucket by bucket and wagon by wagon. He then had to drag all everybody's shit outside the city where he would sell it to farmers. For his troubles, the Stercorarius got 11 copper coins. Considering Rome's bumpy stone streets, it wasn't a rare occurrence for one of these shit wagons to literally flood the Stercorarius. So considering you were basically a personified toilet flush, this job was one of the weirder ones. The urine tax collector was basically the big brother of the shit collector. As introduced by Emperor Nero, the urine tax was subsequently taken upon by his son Titus. Urine was widely used in various chemical processes, such as extracting ammonia to clean and whiten clothes, soaking animal skin before tanning, and even using it